we are to talk about orthographic mapping. You might be wondering why we're talking about orthographic mapping. Well, one of the reasons is because it's such an important cognitive process that happens as students are learning to read. It's often neglected. Of course, it's not in one of the big 5 pillars from the National Reading Panel. So we're going to spend some time on it this week so that we can better understand what this process is and how to help our colleagues better understand it and how to help students develop their orthographic mapping skills. We'll also want to consider what kinds of activities or interventions facilitate orthographic mapping and what kinds of activities actually make it harder for students to map words to long-term memory. For reference, we have 3 texts for this week. The first one is Phonological Recoding and Self-Teaching from David Scher. This is from 1995. The second 2 are 2 chapters from the Kilpatrick book, Reading, Development, and Difficulties. We have chapter 4 about orthographic mapping and how it facilitates sight word memory and vocabulary learning. And then chapter 8 looks at word level reading difficulties, as well as the prevention and intervention studies related to those difficulties. So just to back up a little bit, orthographic mapping is the mental process used to store words for immediate, effortless retrieval. For a moment and consider what reading looks like for students at different points in development. On the left-hand side, we have a struggling first grade reader. The outside circle is the total mental resources available to that reader. The shaded part is the print processing, and the white part is the comprehension. So as you see, this first grader is using most of their energy to process the print on the page. So we can imagine that this reader is sounding out or decoding a lot of words as they go. It's very possible that this reader could finish a short story or passage and not really know what they read, but could have read it accurately. Let's look at the 4th grade reader on the right side. Print processing is making up a much smaller portion of this student's cognitive processing. So this student can think about comprehension, make inferences, connect the text to other texts that they've read, read with expression and prosody. So as this cognitive resource allocation changes over time, all of this is happening because words are becoming orthographically mapped for this reader. So this reader's orthographic lexicon, or all of the words that are available immediately to this reader, that number of words is really increasing over time so that the reader can focus on comprehension as opposed to sounding out the words. Here's another way to think about where orthographic mapping fits into other aspects of reading. We're all familiar with the reading rope from Scarborough. So if we look on the bottom part under word recognition, what we see here is that there are 3 pieces to the rope. Once students acquire phonological awareness and some decoding skills, they can start to orthographically map words so that those words are available for sight recognition. Let's pause here to think about how well we understand orthographic mapping. You can jot down your answers on a piece of paper and then we'll check them on the next slide. Storing words in permanent memory requires blank level skills. A blank blank is a word that is recognized automatically and effortlessly without sounding it out or guessing. Scientific evidence shows that we do not remember words based on a blank memory, even though that does feel intuitive. The specific blank of the blank allows students to recognize words. 5. Strong readers need only blank to blank exposures to new words to learn them. Finally, the majority of students with word recognition difficulties lack this. Go ahead and pause the video to write down your answers, and then when you're ready, resume to check your answers on the next slide. Number 1, storing words in permanent memory requires phoneme level skills. This is different than syllable level skills or even word awareness. We really have to be able to understand words at the phoneme level. A sight word is a word that is recognized automatically. So we know that each person's sight word vocabulary, their orthographic lexicon, is different because they've had different experiences decoding. We do not remember words based on visual memory, even though that feels intuitive. It makes sense that we would think we might use our visual memory because, after all, we are looking at words, but we store words using our phonological memory. The specific order of the letters allows students to recognize words. Think about if one letter was off. We wouldn't know what the word is right away. Proficient readers need only 1 to 4 exposures to new words to learn them. When we think of exposures, what that means in this context is that the student is actually doing the work of decoding those words. If the word is just flashed in front of them and they don't do the work, that doesn't count as an actual exposure. And then lastly, the majority of students with word recognition difficulties lack phonemic proficiency. We'll take a look at what phonemic proficiency means later on. But a few quick terms before we keep going. Let's think about decoding and word recognition as 2 different things. Decoding is the process of connecting letters and sounds to pronounce a word. It's methodical and it's not immediate or effortless. And as Ehri says, it's that process of transforming graphemes into phonemes and blending the phonemes into pronunciations. Word recognition is that immediate, effortless recall of sound, spelling, and meaning. This is our goal. Once we recognize pretty much all of the words we read, our brains are able to use that brain space to comprehend what we're reading. Here's another way to think about those 2 different roots of words. We have the phonological and the orthographic roots. This comes back to the idea of the dual root model from Max Coulthard. On the top part of this diagram, you see the student is engaging in the phonological root. The student identifies the letter, matches the letter to the sound. Does the same for C, K, A, T, T. Then blends all the sounds. K, A, T, cat. On the bottom side of this diagram, the student immediately recognizes cat and says cat. What we want students to do is be able to work through this top loop to then move words to this bottom loop of immediate sight recognition. Here's another piece that we want to think about. All of these elements are related to orthographic mapping. We have the phonology, the pronunciation, the orthography, the spelling, and also the semantics, the meaning of the word. So Ehri and Miles went a bit deeper into the meaning of the word, as well as how the word meaning is acquired and other aspects of the word and how those are acquired based on how the word is taught. So one question here that you can think about for the discussion board is, what did we learn from their article, their chapter, about the significance of word reading experiences in relation to reading, spelling, orthographic mapping, and vocabulary development? Here's one more way to think about where orthographic mapping fits in with other aspects of reading. First, we have early phonological awareness. And from there, we can build on that to develop letter names and letter sounds. And as we see, these processes are reciprocal. So when we build our phonological skills, then our word reading skills also improve. So as we develop those phonological and phonemic awareness skills, we get all the way down to advanced phonemic awareness or phonemic proficiency, and we become more proficient at decoding and encoding, which leads us to orthographic mapping. Let's move on here to the concept of phonological recoding and self-teaching. Coding and self-teaching are intertwined. Phonological recoding, which is the translation from print to sound, functions as a self-teaching mechanism. What that means is that as students decode words, as they translate them from print to sound, they learn about the relationships between the letters and the sounds, and that allows them to build their sight word vocabulary or their orthographic lexicon. What we see in the share article is that phonological recoding is really the best way to learn printed words. And if you dig a little bit deeper into that, you'll see that things like direct instruction or even contextual guessing or using pictures really does not promote that self-teaching mechanism. And we want to do that with our instruction. We want to help students get started, give them a jump start so that they can then use their reading to learn even more on their own. Let's take a look at some irregular words. Go ahead and write these words down on your scratch piece of paper, and then think about, are these words irregular? More specifically, are they temporarily irregular, as in a student might not have learned a particular pattern, or are they permanently irregular in that once a student learns all the patterns, the word would still not follow typical correspondences? Take a moment to jot down your notes. Try to figure out which words are irregular, and if the words are irregular, which features of those words are irregular. When you're ready, you can go on to the next slide. Let's take a look at these words. Him is always regular. Three letters, 3 sounds, and all of the letters represent the sounds that we would expect them to. Was is a little bit different. W, that makes what we expect. Z. So the short A, what we think is going to be a short A rather, makes a short U sound, and the S makes Z. Sometimes the S does make Z, but that's often learned a little bit later. So in this case, the A is permanently irregular, and the S is temporarily irregular. In the word please, the only letter that seems strange at first is the E at the end. We might wonder, what is that E doing there? It's not making the vowel long, as in a vowel consonant E pattern. The E at the end of the word please shows that the final S or the Z sound is part of the root word and is not the suffix S. A few other examples of that pattern are in the words like house, pause, bronze, and cheese. Now let's look at the word one. N. It has 3 sounds and 3 letters, but they don't match up very well at all. The O makes w and The silent E does nothing. So the only part of this word that is regular is the N. If you look at the word that, it actually is regular. However, it may be temporarily irregular for students who haven't learned that the digraph TH makes the voiced version of that digraph as opposed to the voiceless version as in like in this. Finally, the word yes is regular. You might be familiar with a subtest like this, in which students are required to read as many nonsense or pseudo words as they can in exactly 1 minute. What I'd like you to think about here is what skills are required to do this well. What would poor performance on the nonsense word fluency test tell us? And also, what might it not tell us? And more generally, what do we know about pseudo word performance and the implications of a student's pseudo word performance on actual reading of connected text? If you'd like to do a fun experiment, you can pause the video and try to read some of these words. If not, you can post about any of those questions on the discussion board. Think about some of the very important findings on phonological recoding and self-teaching. I want to highlight a few things as we look at this article, and I definitely recommend reading the whole article when you have a bit more time. If we look at the self-teaching mechanism, bullet point number 1 is about the fact that this teaching mechanism is item-based. That means that students learn words one by one as they decode them. You might think, what are the implications of this, the fact that they learn it word by word, as opposed to more of a phase approach? Well, what it means is that we really want students to have practice applying what they've learned immediately after they've learned it, so that they can get those exposures to all of those important words, especially some of those more common words and some of those irregular words that need a little bit more repetition. If we look also at the beginning of the self-teaching process, there are sound symbol associations and phonemic awareness. Without one or the other, students won't be able to teach themselves as they go. And by self-teaching, let's be clear that this doesn't mean that they are left to their own devices. What it means is that as students read words, they gain the ability to read even more new words. Another important point from the second section of this reading is that phonological skills are primary and orthographic skills are secondary. As it turns out, the word-specific orthographic knowledge is actually acquired in the wake of successful self-teaching, not before it, and we do need decoding skill and imprint exposure to come first. In the final section, we learned about the importance of explicit phonemic awareness, as well as that students need practice blending sounds together. If that does not come naturally, as it doesn't for many students, we need to offer practice in blending sounds in isolation, and then blending sounds when those phonemes are connected to graphemes. Anytime that you see those Elkonin boxes or word chaining boxes, it's very possible that that is connected to this idea of needing blending practice. We also learned in this section that mere exposure to phonemes and phonemic awareness is not enough, and in fact, a lack of phonemic awareness not only merely can, but does cause reading failure. So if we are having students who are really having trouble getting those words to stick, to be the glue as you saw on the first slide, if they're having trouble gluing those words into long-term memory for immediate recall, what we want to investigate is the strength of their phonemic awareness. Let's take a look at a few different activities we might use and think about which ones are beneficial to students, which ones facilitate their orthographic mapping, and which ones don't, and which ones might even make it harder for students to orthographically map words. I spoke a little bit about my previous experience using the flashcard method, and we talked in class about how this method might not be effective and often isn't, because what we're looking at here is mapping graphemes to phonemes, and if the correspondence is not clear, mere exposure and repetition is not going to help a student. So what we need to do instead is make those letter sound connections explicit, rather than just exposing the student to the word as a whole. Here's another example. It looks like this teacher has given the students an activity to get them to remember the word every. So it looks like what this teacher is having the student do is identify the word every, write the word every, color the word every, each letter in different color crayons, highlight it, and then write it in a sentence. So this seems like what this teacher is thinking is that the repetition of the word will help it stick in the student's memory. But unfortunately, nowhere on this page, and it could be elsewhere in the lesson, absolutely, but nowhere on this page are the students encouraged to think about the letter sound connections in the word. Here's an example of every taught in a more explicit way that highlights the phoneme-grapheme connections. In this case, the is highlighted as kind of the heart section of this word, the part that the students need to remember by heart. And while this may not be as common, it's not that unusual. We see every. This is not that uncommon. We see as in heard in many situations. Here's another instructional practice that often appears. The idea is called mix it and fix it, and what the student does is they look at the word with the letters all jumbled, write the words in the correct order, and then write it in different colors. The question here is that what is the mechanism for learning? If this is the approach that is meant to be effective, then the idea would be that the student learns the word and puts it in their memory from their visual system. But as we know, students remember words from their phonological system. So this activity actually might be frustrating for students because it doesn't highlight phoneme-grapheme connections. And in the mix-it column, it may just be confusing for students who are already struggling to remember which letters go in which order. So, for students who are not skilled in orthographic mapping, that simple exposure, as we saw in several of those examples, and the repetition, that doesn't improve their ability to retain newly encountered words in any substantial way. Now, we might think, well, flashcard learning works for other subjects. It absolutely does. But in this case, what we're looking at is matching the phonemes and graphemes together. We're not looking at a visual whole. So this is not really the paired associate kind of learning that flashcards really are useful for. Kilpatrick and O'Brien look at the word learning research and compare that to intervention research. They note that these two areas of study often tend to be separate, and so they attempt to join them in this chapter. Toward the end of the chapter, they analyzed a number of interventions and categorized them into 3 groups based on how effective they were: minimal, moderate, or highly effective. One thing for you to look at as you read this part of the chapter is what factor distinguished the effectiveness of the interventions, and what, if anything, surprised you about what they found. Here's a summary of that research. When no phonemic awareness is incorporated, the results are limited. When some phonemic skills are taught, and often this is accuracy and blending and segmenting, the results are stronger. And then finally, when phonemic manipulation skills are taught, the outcomes are the strongest. Let's take a look at how phonemic awareness develops. Phonemic awareness begins with isolating or identifying sounds. Usually this is the initial sound of a word, and then the final sound, and then the medial sound. The next skill is blending, then segmenting, although for some students, segmenting is harder than blending, but usually blending is easier. And then the final 3 fall into the category of manipulation: adding, deleting, and substituting sounds. We want students to be proficient at phonemic manipulation, that is, adding, deleting, and substituting sounds. If they can do that, what it essentially means is that they can isolate or identify, and then segment the word, and then manipulate the phoneme, and then put it all back together. That's about 4 steps, and to do that automatically shows that a student really has phonemic proficiency. And if a sub-skill like phonemic proficiency is automatic, that sets a student up for success when they get to words. Here are some multisyllabic nonsense words. Take a moment to pause the video and try to read these words. What did you notice as you read these words? What strategies did you use to divide the words into syllables or to figure out how the vowels sounded? You probably depended on your phonemic awareness. You may have also relied upon your ability to notice suffixes or prefixes, or perhaps you thought about what syllable types you saw. But without phonemic proficiency, it would have been very, very difficult for you to read those words. A little more on advanced phonemic proficiency. Basic phonemic awareness prepares students to phonically decode words, but it doesn't prepare their brains to store that sequence of the letters in their memory. So what that means is that a student might have to keep blending a word sounds multiple times if it has not yet been stored in long-term memory. That's that top loop of the phonological root that we looked at earlier. Advanced phonemic proficiency means accuracy and automaticity with manipulation tasks. When students have achieved that advanced phonemic proficiency, then they can orthographically map words to their memory and read them correctly and automatically in future encounters. So these words were, I would imagine, new for all of us, but if we looked at them again, we may have already mapped them even in one encounter, maybe up to 4. Let's take a look at additional instructional practices and think about whether they are orthographic mapping, whether they facilitate orthographic mapping, whether they make it harder, or perhaps they're just related to some other aspect of reading. Example 1. Is it orthographic mapping? Student A. I need to re-zip my sweatshirt. Student B. What do you mean? Student A. I mean, I need to zip it again. Student B. Oh, I get it. Re means again. In this situation, student B has learned that re means again. In other words, student B has learned a new prefix, just in context. Take a moment to think about whether this is orthographic mapping. This, in fact, is morphological learning. It's great, it's just different than orthographic mapping. This interaction was oral, so the student wasn't connecting speech and print, and they weren't learning about reading particular words. However, this is great. Example 2. The teacher asked the student to take a nonsense word fluency test, and this is how the student reads the words in the yellow box. Web, droll, I don't know, rate, sasp. Let's think about this. Is this orthographic mapping? Well, what the student was doing was encountering these nonsense or pseudo words, most likely for the first time, and trying to decode them. So what the teacher was doing here was trying to determine how well the student could do that, because we know that reading of nonsense words really is an excellent correlate to actual word reading. This student looks like they're having a bit of trouble with vowel sounds, with complex vowel sounds, with the hard and the soft C, and perhaps they don't even have much of a strategy for some orthographic patterns, such as the OA and stoach. So this is not exactly orthographic mapping happening here, but it does allow a teacher insight into how a student's orthographic mapping abilities are progressing. Example 3. Here's a word that I have seen come up just in the past week. The word is tame. The teacher says, here's a new word for us. What syllable type do you see? Student A, it's a vowel consonant E syllable. Teacher, yes, so how do we pronounce the vowel? Student B, it's a long A. Teacher, let's read the word. Student C, tame, tame, tame. Teacher, great. Do you think you'll know it the next time you see it? Student B, yes, we already decoded it, so we'll remember it. Now, student B may be a bit of a teacher's pet here. Nevertheless, student B is claiming to have orthographically mapped the word tame. Here's another example. The teacher says our trick word today is 1. Draw a huge number 1 on your paper. Now write O-N-E within the number. Trace over each letter with a different color. Now you'll be ready for the quiz tomorrow. Is this orthographic mapping? In this scenario, the teacher is trying to get the students to remember an irregular word that also is a high-frequency word. However, the teacher did not make connections between the letters and the sounds. Therefore, this activity will not really build the students' orthographic mapping for this word. Example 5. The teacher says, we learned that the letter C makes the k sound already. Now we will learn that it makes another sound. The other sound it makes is s. Here are some words when the letter C makes s. Let's read them together. city, cell, cent, and so on. Is this orthographic mapping? Well, it's tricky. The teacher is teaching a phonics lesson here, so in other words, the students are learning to make the connections between the letters and the sounds. But as the students are reading this list of words, they're really focusing on that initial C, and later on in the list, the C, that soft C, moves to later in the word. So what the teacher has done here is set the students up for orthographic mapping of words with the soft C later on, but with one encounter, students are most likely not mapping this orthographically. However, this is a good way to introduce students to the soft C. Our final example is it orthographic mapping. This is an activity from Heart Word Magic where the student writes the irregular word in the box on the left, segments the word, and then identifies which part of the word is the part that is irregular. So instead, in the word said, the students identify that the AI makes the eh instead of a, as we might expect, and they fill in a little heart there. So this is helping the students break down those words and make those letter sound connections. In fact, this is helping students orthographically map these irregular words. Here are some questions to think about. How can we design curriculum or support instruction to help students orthographically map words? How would you explain orthographic mapping to someone who has never heard of it? This might be an administrator, a parent, or a teacher. What are some misconceptions regarding sight words, and how might we correct these? What implications do the findings from the orthographic learning research have on early reading instruction? And finally, what connections do you see with the work of Washington, Blackman, Joshi, Seidenberg, Miles, Kilpatrick, and others? I look forward to hearing your thoughts.